So I'm Corey Fahrenkoff. Welcome to Sturgis Library's program, The Curious and Fascinating Tales, or Curious and Fascinating Stories of Barnstable, presented by Nancy Shoemaker of the Barnstable Historical Society. I'm Corey Fahrenkoff, the Assistant Director of the library, and thank you for all coming to hang out with us digitally. It's great to see all your tiny little faces in all these tiny little boxes, so that's always great. A couple of things before we get going. Like I said, if you have any questions for me, the chat's open. Feel free to send stuff along. You're all muted, such as Zoom Live. And you can have your camera on or you can have it off, whatever makes you happy. So yeah, there's one, we've got a bunch of upcoming programs that you can all find listed online on our website, sturgislibrary.org. And I always suggest for people to join our newsletter if you haven't already, so you can keep up to date with programs like this and other historical stuff that goes on, our talks on environmental stuff and gardening and author talks. But we've got a really cool, it's kind of like an author panel discussion coming up on next Tuesday at this exact same time. So 6:30 p.m. We're going to be talking about mystery and crime fiction with 4 award-winning, like wicked famous authors. And it's going to be a good time. The authors are Steph Cha, Rachel Housel Hall, Elizabeth Hand, and Dan Shawn. So if you like mysteries and you want to hear some writers talking about how they write, why they write, the kind of stuff they're into reading, just general talk about the genre, feel free to give me an email and I'll sign you up for it. But if you don't want to go to it, no worries. It's completely okay. Live your life. Yeah, and so we're going to get going. First of all, we want to say thank you to Nancy and to Betsy Wheeler of the Barnstable Historical Society. We do tons of stuff with them all the time. Like we bounce questions off each other. We do joint displays. And this is one of the first joint programs we've done in a while. And we're really excited to have Nancy here to tell you all this awesome history. And we're also really excited to see how the community has responded to this and how many people are really interested in it. So we want to just say a big thank you to the Barnstable Historical Society because they're great. And on that note, I'm going to be quiet and Nancy's going to take over. So Nancy, it's all.
Hi, everybody. I wish I could see you all, but the screen's not big enough to see a lot of people I know, though. Yeah, we're going to talk about the town of Barnstable's colorful history. And I think we will entertain you with some pretty interesting stories. So we're going to start back in the 1700s, and we're going to go right to Abigail, and then quote, Nabby Freeman. And she ran a small grocery store just east of the old colonial courthouse. So you can start showing pictures probably. Thank you. Oh, well, I'm going to keep talking, but that's at the end of the show. So that's, yeah. Okay, as we'll keep moving on it. So you got the old colonial courthouse, which is now the home of Tales of Cape Cod. And then, yeah, whoop. See, you're going to see the whole show quickly. There you go. So she had a little grocery store, like I say, just to the east of the old colonial courthouse. And she was a Tory sympathizer, not to be confused with Corey. Let me explain a few of these political labels in the story so that you can understand them. A little bit of background information. In 1776, King George III was in power in England. He was crowned king in 1760, and with him came taxes on tea, on coffee, on wine, and these were all declared during the Sugar Act of 1764. Then the Stamp Act came along, and every piece of paper in your home had to have the king's stamp on it, which of course you had to pay for each of those stamps. And it went so far as they demanded a stamp on every playing card in your house. British soldiers could burst into your home and make sure that you had a stamp on everything that needed it and were in general obeying the rules of the king. And that could be done at any time. So Nabby was okay with his rules. She, whoops, I have notes that have, I'm gonna have to switch to other notes. My notes are cut off on the side. This is not good. Okay, I think they're right over across the way. I can probably read pretty well, but I haven't got it all here. So she was a Tory. She was very much into the King of England and what he was doing with our colonies. But there were other people who were not. The other group of Barnstable residents were a group that revolted against King George, and they were called the Whigs. I have a husband coming to save me. Do you see the other notes, Paul? They're probably in my office. Well, you think you plan ahead and you don't, but I can improvise. I know my stuff here. So she would allow the king's tea to be sold at her store. She did a lot of things that the Whigs, the people who were against King George III, she would really rankle them. And there was a Liberty pole that was out in front of the Tales of Cape Cod building, which was the old colonial courthouse. And that was the court of common pleas. So if Corey stole my pig and I was mad about it, I could go to the old colonial courthouse and get my pig back. So she would be going back and forth over to her favorite tavern. And her favorite tavern, yeah, that's okay. Isn't that weird? I'm sorry, my notes are not here. So her favorite tavern was not the Crocker Tavern. I'm sorry. The one you're looking at right now is the Whigs Tavern. And even now, we have Barnstable Tavern, we have the Dolphin Restaurant. So we all have our favorite places to go to. The Whigs, the ones who were into getting away from King George III and having a revolution, they would go to this tavern. Now, the next picture, I think, will be of the colonial courthouse. And you can go there, and there you see. And so she lived a little bit beyond the courthouse to the right. She would walk over to have her drinks and say these nasty things. And finally, somebody got very upset. Many people got very upset. She was saying other bad things about the Whigs, and they finally said that the Whigs were so mad at her that she refused to surrender her tea. And that finally they found that someone, not her, but someone had uprooted their Liberty pole. So when we think of the Whigs and the fathers of our country as good guys, in this story, not so much. A group of young men entered her house in the middle of the night, dragged her out onto the green. And the story is that they tarred and feathered her, then tied her to a fence rail, which they dragged down the street. They made her promise to never meddle with politics again, and then they released her. So kind of a sad story. You can go to the next one, Corey. And this one shows, I love this picture. It shows the old colonial courthouse on the left. It shows the very beginning of the Episcopal Church, which was where the Loring or the loyalists of King George III went to have their drinks. It was on that site. And then beyond the barn that you see way over to the right next to that would be our Barnstable Historical House, and the next one would be the Crocker Tavern. So this all happened in that area. Now, interesting that the town of Barnstable was the only town on Cape Cod to vote against independence. And there are a few reasons for that. One of the major ones is that it was a shire town, and an awful lot of the people who lived in Barnstable Village also worked in Barnstable Village and were being paid by the king, were part of the government. But also, we always have to wonder, was the treatment of Abigail Freeman, possibly one of the factors? So that's the end of that tale. And now we're going to go on to James Otis. And James Otis is known for his fiery speech in the State House in February of 1761. I think most people who tuned in tonight probably know all these stories about how he worked fighting for independence. This one day in February of 61, John Adams was in attendance, and he said later, then and there, independence was born. I'm missing one of the words because it's off my page. There's so much to tell you about James Otis, and we could be here until sunrise tomorrow, which we won't do, to discuss the Otis family. But I do want to tell you a very beautiful and little known story about James, and this was at the end of his life. In 1771, he got into a fight with a Tory in a Boston Tavern, and he had a traumatic head injury. He would never be quite the same, and eventually he was declared insane. He was taken in by other members of his family and friends, but eventually he became a ward of the state. He lived for a while, with a man named Daniel Souter on the peninsula of Hull, the town of Hull. It was called Nantasket at the time. At this point, he wasn't easy to deal with because this head injury had really changed his manner and behavior. But there was a young child who lived nearby. Her name was Susanna Haswell. She was born in England. Her mother died soon after her birth. Her father moved to Boston, where he was a customs inspector. And James, living nearby, took to her, and I don't mean this in any lascivious way. She reminded him of his sister, Mercy Otis Warren. He had been an ally of Mercy's and made sure, stood up against her father, that he thought she should get a classical education, which eventually happened, and she became the first young woman on Cape Cod who likely did get such an education. This young girl, the neighbor, Susanna, in Hull, had the same kind of interest and passion in learning and writing. She became actually a very well-known writer, poet, educator. She was also an actress and a novelist. She wrote against slavery, and she was the first woman geographer, and contrary to Mercy's views, was a supporter of women's rights. Mercy had some other little ways about her, which we might get into at another time, but such a beautiful story that he reached out towards the end of his life to this young girl who reminded him of his sister and really helped her get on her way in her education. Check her out sometime. Her name was Susanna Haswell, and then there's a last name, which I don't have right here, Rowson, R-O-W-S-O-N. Now you can also, if you don't want to check her out online, there's a book coming out by a gentleman named Jeffrey Hacker, H-A-C-K-E-R, and he's publishing a book about the relationship between James and Mercy, the brother and sister relationship. And there's a chapter devoted to this lovely relationship between him and this young girl too. One little footnote, and that is that James Otis died suddenly in 1783. He died by a bolt of lightning. He was standing in the kitchen door of a house in Andover, a friend's house, and he had written and was struck by lightning. I didn't need to get that in. Years earlier, he had written to his sister, "My dear sister, I hope with righteous providence that shall take me out of time into eternity, that it will be a flash of lightning that will take me." So interesting that he forecasted his own death of by lightning. So we're going to move on to the next picture. Now this is a little different tone here. This lady went by Annie, by Anne, by Emma. She had many different names. And this is not her, I have to say. This is a picture of someone who might have had some of her attributes. This woman was a Civil War spy. Another accurate term for her vocation might be Lady of the Evening. When she left her home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, she had good intentions. She wanted to go to Washington, D.C. and volunteer for the Union Army, helping them in some way with nursing or just helping in general the cause of the Union Army. But they turned her down. She was too young and not experienced. So she decided to go down and offer some help anyway, as some ladies often did. And often it was soldiers' wives, or it was young women looking for an adventure and wanting to give extra service to the troops. But there were also this group of ladies, and she became one of them rather quickly, who did a little extra service for gentlemen who were in the Union Army. She was very beautiful, and she had her choice of officers. And it is said that on her general belt, meaning a general in the service, she had 6 notches of 6 different generals. So I'm glad this is hopefully no young people here. But on January 13th, 1863, she was arrested for being a Confederate spy. She was 2 months later found in a General Stoughton's bedroom when a Confederate spy came in and was accused of spying, and she was thought to be in collusion, and she was arrested, but then she was released. So finally, she has done a few of these things too many times. She also was interested in General Custer, and another general was so jealous that he had her arrested, and she was sent back to Massachusetts, where she had been born. She was born in Cambridge, Mass, as a prisoner. So she spent some time, this very interesting, beautiful woman, in Barnstable Village. In the spring of 1864, the Yarmouth Register wrote, Miss Emma Jones, since many months, again, I'm missing some words here, since in the Army of the Potomac as Major Jones, and subsequently arrested, is now up north and is confined in the House of Correction in the state. It goes on to say that it is a justice to state that she denies the character attributed to her, and it also does state how she is quite pleasant to look at. She denied any of these things. She was here at Barnstable for about 2 months, and then she reached out to a congressman and former mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, who took an interest in her. He appealed to President Lincoln and to the Secretary of War to release her. So they released her in July of 1864. And guess what? After that, actually a couple of years later, in 1866, there was no public record of her. So we really don't know what happened to Annie Emma Jones after that. A little footnote, and you can go to the next picture. There's our beautiful old jail. This is considered to be the oldest wooden jail in America. Standing at the door is Louis Vullimere. I took this picture last summer. He donated, this is Marion Vullimire's son. He donated those signs that you see on the jail, which really are beautiful. It's very, very nice of him to do that. She was not in the jail when the jail was in behind a house on the southwest corner of Old Jail Lane. And she would be in the jailer's home because, of course, they didn't want her mixing with the other prisoners who were men. So she was put into the jailer's home, and that home eventually was cut in half, and part of it went to the other side of Jail Lane. And I've been in the room that they think she stayed in. So we can go on to the next picture. And this is about the Swift family. So you've driven by Bone Hill Road and probably always wondered, strange name for a Bone Hill Road. It has nice Audubon Society down at the end. Well, this is about Annie and Gustavus Franklin Swift. He was born in Sagamore, which was called West Sandwich at that time, on the family farm. And at age 14, he quit school and he went to work in his brother Noble's butcher shop. 2 years later, he opened his own beef and cattle business with the help of $400 from one of his uncles, and he purchased livestock, which he had to pick up in Boston and drive them, as in move them along by foot, to Eastham. It was a 10-day journey. So he thought enough of that. He married a young woman from Eastham, Anna Maria Higgins, in 1861. And in 1862, they opened a small slaughterhouse in Comaquid, east of Barnstable Village. She had 3 of her children there, and now you know the reason the road is named Bone Hill, because there were plenty of bones with the butchery business going on. This picture is taken before the house burned down. Her daughter, Helen Swift, wrote in 1937, very few people realize how greatly my mother, Annie, contributed to her husband's success. You can go to the next picture. And the company moved to Chicago, of course, and that became the Swift Company, making hot dogs and bologna and all those things that we still eat to this day. And Gustavus Swift served as president. Now, after the house burned down, there was not much left, but this is, and it's a little charred, but this is in the Barnstable Historical Society's collection. It's part of their Weathervane, pointing the way that the weather was coming from, then the wind. So we will now point the way to go to the next person, Anna Howard Shaw. She was a medical director, one of the first ordained female Methodist ministers in the United States, and she was very much a part of the women's suffrage movement. She was born in England, but raised in a log cabin in Michigan for much of her childhood and became a school teacher. She came to Cape Cod in 1876 as a substitute minister and spent 7 years preaching in Dennis. Then she bought land on Weano Beach in Osterville in 1892 and built a cottage. And she shocked the you-know-what out of the neighborhood because her visiting friends, and she had a lot of women friends coming down to discuss the mission of women having the right to vote. In fact, her partner, her life partner, was Lucy Anthony, who was a niece of Susan B. Anthony. So she shocked her neighborhood by doing something, and you'll click to the next picture. Her friends would come and visit her in outfits like this one, but they would eventually say, we've had enough of that. We don't want to be wearing bathing suits. And this is a bathing suit of a woman. So they would wear men's bathing suits, which were still pretty covering, but it absolutely shocked all of Osterville. She was the head of the Women's Committee of the U.S. Council of National Defense. National Defense. She became the first woman to earn the Distinguished Service Medal. And she passed away when she was traveling with Harvard presidents A. Lawrence Lowell and a former president, when I don't have the name written on here at the moment. They were traveling around the country and she passed away during that trip. They were trying to get the 19th Amendment ratified. So next picture, we're going to change the subject a little bit and we're going to go to Mad Jack Percival. An awful lot of us know of Mad Jack Percival and the fact that he came from West Barnstable. He was the only captain of the Old Ironsides, or the USS Constitution, to circumnavigate the world. He traveled 52,279 nautical miles in 495 days, of course, with his crew too. He was a very colorful character. Author James Ellis of West Barnstable wrote a biography, and I'll show you the cover when we get done with all of this. It's a biography of Mad Jack Percival that's so well researched and written. He writes of, and this is a picture of that, Percival's run-in with the missionaries in Hawaii, because the young local ladies like to go out to the visiting ships in the evening and socialize with the men. Now, in the meantime, the island had been taken over by an American missionaries, but one in particular. And he and Percival really went at each other as to whether their young men on the Constitution. This is not the Constitution, it's a different vessel. And I have the name, but again, it's not on my sheet. What happened is the type is missing, is running off my sheet. So I'm working on a little bit of my type. In the end, it was really a fight between this minister and Percival. Percival persisted, and he was not as into worrying about the social rights of his young men as he was also worried that this reverend was trying to take over the island and take over it in the name of America, where he really was not part of the government. So that was part of his problem. So what we have with Percival, and again, he was fascinating. He did so many. He was the first American to ever fire a shot in what is now Vietnam soil. He, during a ceremony, was told that one of their lines was fouled, and he jumped off the ship in I think it was New York Harbor, and tried to unfoul the line. So, full dress uniform, plunk, goes into the water. He was just a very active man, very passionate man, and very much loved by everyone who sailed with him. So you can go to the next picture. And here is a picture of Mad Jack Percival, again, from West Barnstable. When he died, he gave a lot of the money that he had. He lived off Cape up in Dorchester for most of his later life. But a lot of the money went to building the wall of the cemetery, the ancient cemetery in West Barnstable, that's on the corner of 6A and Route 149. And his grave is there with his wife, Maria. They didn't have children, but they seem to have had she was 20 years younger, but they had a very long and happy life together. You will see a plaque for them, so go over and check that out sometime. And again, notice the epaulet on the side, on the right of his right shoulder. Go to the next picture. And that is the epaulet that we actually have of his in the collection of Barnstable Historical Society. So we're going to move on to another sea captain, and his name is Captain Jenkins. And he is also from West Barnstable, was also from West Barnstable. He also traveled the globe. As a young child, he studied the classics at the Sandy Street School, but then he went off to sea at the age of 14. He sailed the world on many long voyages. During these voyages, he taught himself French, read a variety of books, and learned to play the violin. He commanded the Chilo, which was out of Boston at one time. And in Singapore, he met a friend of his. They would take regular routes. So when they came into a harbor, very often they would meet the same gentleman that they had known from other ports, other harbors. And this gentleman was a man named Safford, and he was from Salem, Mass. So they were invited back in Singapore to a local merchant's house. They normally wouldn't do that because it wasn't always a safe thing to do, but they did. And this gentleman gave them their one and only opium smoking experience. They each smoked a pipeful and experienced a little bit of something, but their host smoked pipe after pipe after pipe and became insensible. So Jenkins, who wrote a wonderful journal, it really tells us a lot. He said, the stuff tasted pleasantly enough, although it was a good deal of trouble to smoke. On the whole, I should say opium smoking is less disgusting than the drunkard, for the drunkard is an insane brute, but the opium smoker is only a happy fool. He retired and started back to West Barnstable and started the West Barnstable Choral Society. Interestingly enough, his daughter was Elizabeth Crocker Jenkins, who was the major mover and shaker of the restoration of the 1717 Meeting House in West Barnstable. In 1997, there were journals that had been written by James and his wife Ruth, and they were published. So that's something that I would imagine Sturgis Library has, and someone should check into that. Okay, now we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about something a little more earthy, I guess. This is Dr. Samuel Pitcher and his wife. He invented or developed Pitcher's Castoria, which was known for its cure of diarrhea. And you can see the next picture is an ad. And this is an ad for the McGathlin drugstore, which was in the east end of Hyannis. And oh, I wish it was still there. They say it was one of the most beautiful drugstores in New England. It had marble countertops. But back to the cure for diarrhea. This is shown, it's a medicine that was made of sassafras and 17% alcohol. So maybe we can make our own. Eventually, he was bought out and it became Fletcher's Castoria. Pitcher's Way is named after this doctor. Okay, and our next picture, we're moving on to something a little different. This is Evelyn Beatrice Longland Batchelder. And she was fascinated with sculpture when she went to visit Chicago's Columbian Exposition. So she became a sculptor and became the first woman sculptor to be a member of the American Academy of Design. She studied with Daniel Chester French. Her first victory statue won the honor of being in the Louisiana Exposition. And under French, she sculpted many of the eagles and wreaths in memorials. So here she is at the studio of Daniel Chester French. And we can go on to the next picture. She even sculpted the bronze doors of the U.S. Naval Chapel in Annapolis and those in Wellesley Library. And one of her most famous creations is this one on Broadway in Manhattan. This is a 24-foot high, 40-ton bronze statue. And this woman is holding lightning bolts in one hand and in the other hand, a coil of wire. She covered it with 40,000 pieces of gold leaf. She worked from her Osterville studio overlooking North Bay, and you can go to the next picture, from Oyster Harbors, where she made this beautiful, large bronze bust, it would eventually be, this is clay, of Thomas Alva Edison in 1952. And this sculpture is at the Naval Research Lab in Washington, D.C. And here, who knew all these things were happening in our different villages? Okay, the next one is Elnora Pinkney Rose. And I only have this one picture to show you. This is an artifact of a ticket to something that she invented, she made happen. She was a daughter of enslaved people who were, and was born on St. Helena Island off the coast of South Carolina. It was Beaufort County largest slave colony. So she came from a tough place. She eventually was allowed to leave the island, and she moved to Hyannis, and she married a local named Louis Lima Rose. They adopted a number of children from the South, and she was a parishioner of the Zion Union Church in the West End of Hyannis. So a woman who cared about social causes and about doing the right thing. She also cared about music and jazz. In June of 1925, Elnora bought 30 acres of land in Marston's Mills, extending west of Schubel's Pond, and many buildings that were on the property. She founded the popular Roseland Dance Hall in Marston's Mills. And it was a club that ran from 1925 to 1928, which of course was during the Prohibition. It was named for the Roseland in New York City and was open only Saturday evenings. Jazz lovers came from near and far to hear greats such as Ella Fitzgerald and Count Basie's orchestra. There were local musicians who played here as well. During Prohibition, Ma, as she was called, was known to take to her bed when the cops arrived, packing bottles of liquor under the covers with her. The building, sadly, was demolished, and this site of early jazz music has nothing left. I mean, I found this one image of this ticket, except that there are two roads. It's actually one round road, that comes in and goes out. It says Roseland Terrace. Next time you're on Route 149 in Marston's Mills, look for Roseland Terrace, and you will know this is because Roseland Terrace, her jazz club, was there at one time. Okay, we'll move on to the next. And this lovely lady is Renee Longy McWell. She was the daughter of George Longy, who was the founder of the Longy School of Music. She was also a well-known musician. She went to the Paris Conservatory, became the conservatory's co-director and then director. She later taught at Philadelphia's Curtis Institute, where one of her students was Leonard Bernstein. I know I always pronounce that wrong. You can go to the next picture. She taught at Juilliard School of Music, that's her and her father, in New York. She spent summers and holidays in the Little River area of Cotuit, and she turned her garage into a soundproof studio. In 1944, Leonard Bernstein was visiting her, and he played her piano and actually composed on her piano his first symphony, Jeremiah. She then named her piano Jerry after him and his symphony. And when she died, she willed her piano and the score, which for some reason she still had, to Bernstein. Okay, next picture. Everyone, not everyone, but I hope most of you can remember going to Hill's dining room. What a wonderful place. The front door was really the back door. You'd park your car, you'd go into this garden where the corn was as high as an elephant's eye. I mean, it was really a wonderful place to go to. So this story started with a Cape Codder who loved the President of the United States. That's just a little hint of what's coming. He was born in Finland. A lot of Finns came to Hyannis and particularly West Barnstable area in the later 1800s, early 1900s. And he was eventually the manager of the Wagner Farm, which was 57 acres, which became the Barnstable Municipal Airport. So he did that for a long time. He managed that, brought his family up there. And then he had a shoe store on Main Street in Hyannis. But he finally had a family business that kept on for decades, and that was Hill's Dining Room. They were known for their pot roast on, I think it was Tuesday nights, and their chicken pot pies on another night, and they were known for their wonderful Finnish cardamom bread called nisu. So one day in April of 1953, Nestor caught, and you can go to the next picture, a 100-pound halibut. So you're going, what the heck? Why is she saying that? He was a great fan of the president. Getting this halibut, he just decided, I want to load this up in the back of my truck, which he did in a tub of ice. Must have been ice that lasted a long time, because he drove that fish in his truck all the way down to Washington, D.C. to give to President Eisenhower. He was, of course, stopped at the gate. The fish could enter, he couldn't. He went home, and it was, a little disappointing because he didn't get to meet the president, and he never knew if he really ate his wonderful halibut or not. So now, moving on 3 years later, it's now 1956. He catches, no, go back to the same picture. We're still on the halibut. He catches another 100-pound halibut. I actually have a picture of it, but I didn't think we would need to. And he again transports it down to Washington, D.C. Only this time he gets his congressman, who was Donald Nicholson, to warn the White House, and they had connections. So the president's assistants knew that this halibut was coming from this wonderful man from Cape Cod. And they let the fish in the gate, and he got to meet the president. He got to talk to him for 3 minutes. And that was an amazing thing, made his life complete. So now we can go to the next picture. This is Susan Godoy. And I've been working on a book, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but she just passed away in 2020, and it was in December, so not long ago. She was born in 1921. She had the house, and we'll see a picture of that in a minute, but not quite yet. The octagonal house that's on South Street in Hyannis. She was a composer. She was a pianist. At the age of 3, she was writing classical compositions. One of her marches for the organ was played at her graduation. She got a PhD in music, taught in Boston schools. Even at the age of 13, she wrote a symphony that was played before the Boston Symphony Orchestra, that was introduced by Serge Kousseevsky. I'm not talking very well today. Kousseevsky. I'll get it almost right. She was an amazing, accomplished musician and composer, and at such a young age. Now you can go to the next picture. And again, we just lost her this December. That's her house on South Street. She made her home in the pink octagonal house that was her grandfather's, Captain Rodney Baxter, in 1850. The house was built in 1850. It was one of the first octagonal houses in the country, and it had the first indoor bathroom in Hyannis. So you can see that right there. So that's it for her. I think I'm going to go ahead on to, I had one other person. Okay, do I have enough time, Corey? Okay. The next person, this woman is cool. I helped to make an exhibit of the history of Barnstable's airport when they opened up the new building for the airport. I think that was 2014 or 15. And this woman came out, and we were all so amazed at her. There were two photo albums of hers. Her name is Edith Tailspin Kelly. She eventually married a man named Babcock, and she was born in 1920. She was born on Mary Dunn Road when Mary Dunn Road went all the way down, was not broken apart by the addition of the airport going to the east. Her father, Zenas, had a kind of a hamburger sandwiches joint, and so she watched the airport grow and grow as a little girl. And so by the time she's 19, from 1920 to 1939, she had gotten her pilot's license. She's the one on the left with her sister Rita on the right. She not only was an incredible pilot and at such a young age, but she was an incredible photographer. And I believe there's at least one more picture, maybe two. Look at that. Now that's one of their weekend community events that they would have. Picture no television, radio just kind of starting, certainly no internet or anything like that. The airports all around the country were the place of weekend shows and excitement. And she took this picture in 1938 at Hyannis Airport. And is there one more picture? I think a few of you are old enough to remember this. So this, I'm looking through these albums and suddenly there is Edward Everett Horton, who, you know, was an actor from what, the 30s, 40s, 50s. I'm aging myself. And he flew into Hyannis Airport because he was acting at the Dennis Playhouse. So you can take them off, and I just have a few more things to describe to you. And so am I big to all of you? Yes? Okay. The first thing is, if you're interested in some of these books that I talked about, James Ellis, now this is the author from West Barnstable, not the blacksmith from Barnstable Village, is the one who wrote the book about Mad Jack Percival. And he also, let me get it so you can see the whole thing. He also wrote this book of luminaries of West Barnstable. So it was Mad Jack. It's also about Lemuel Shaw, who ended up being the father-in-law of Herman Melville, who had some connections with West Barnstable, and then the two Otis children, Mercy and James. So a great book to read, and I'm sure that the library carries that. Another book that I highly recommend is about the Mercy herself. And then there's that new book that's coming out by this guy named Jeff Hacker. And that's going to be printed by, I'm sure it's been printed by now, by the University of Massachusetts Publishing House. And it's going to be coming out in June. He's planning on coming up here and doing a tour, so to speak, of introducing the book, because where else but in her hometown should he have the book be introduced. Now the Otis family, if people don't realize this, is their homestead was right across the street from the West Barnstable post office, and there is a plaque on a boulder that you can see there if you look. Also, I just want to mention that they're looking for nominations of people to be part of the Mercy Otis Warren presentation, not to be part of, but they're looking for nominations of a woman who they feel has given to society. I won't explain it all, but there's a website for this, and you can certainly see that. And then I have just one other little shameless thing. I have one more thing after this, but and that is a little self-promotion. Jim Gould, who's a Cotuit's historian, just wonderful man. He did a blog on women of Barnstable. He did it about 5 years ago, and maybe 2.5 years ago now. I said, let's make a book together. And so this book is coming out in about a month, and it's Women of Barnstable. So if you like some of the juicy stories you heard tonight, there's a lot, there's over 200 women in here who did some pretty fascinating things. So that's about it. I thought if you ever want to do another one, I'd tell you some other ideas for stories. There's the dog graves on Old Mill Way in Osterville. I'd love to do something on Harrison Carr. Do you all know of him? He was a printer in Barnstable Village. Could do something on Van Cliburn's visit to Barnstable, which people probably don't know about. Dr. Fawcett and his wife's Emily's gravestone. She practiced the eclectic system in 4 states. It says on her medals, they had metal gravestones, like I say, for 40 years and lost that less than that number of people, patients. And on her stone, it says, she was everything a woman should be. Think of all those things, and she was that. Again, I'm just paraphrasing. We could also talk about the ghosts of Barnstable Village, West Barnstable's brick factory, which was a large consumer, making millions of bricks a year. Also the West Barnstable Road that is no longer, the ghostly Nye or Hinkley Lane, the largest salt works on Cape Cod, which were owned by Lauren Crocker, the 2 baby grand pianos that are buried under the road of Mill Way. And then there's always Nathaniel Holmes, who was Cape Cod's gravestone carver extraordinaire. He made about 1,400 stones on Cape Cod, and about 350 of them are in the town of Barnstable. So I just hope I got you excited about history. come and visit the Barnstable Historical Society, which is right across the street from Sturgis. And thank you for listening.
So on that note, thank you so much, Nancy. Everyone's muted, so we got to do this big silent applause. So just imagine like a giant stadium full of
Right.
noise and just happiness and woo and all that good
They
stuff.
were just silent because they were listening so hard.
That's true. That is
And I wish
very
you
true.
could see my notes. The end of this page, it's just not there. So
Just hold it up a little bit.
stumbling a little bit. Forgive me. That's all right. They get the
It's all
idea.
good. But so at that, Nancy, if you want to just hang out for a few minutes, everyone else can log out. Hopefully in the future, we'll do some more programs with Nancy. And if you want to, oh, the other thing I got to tell you is if you have any future questions about history, research, etc., you can either reach out to me at Sturgis Library. You can go to our website, sturgislibrary.org, and check it out, or you can send me emails at sturgisreference@comcast.net. You can find all that information online, or you can go to the Barnstable Historical Society website and find all of their contact information. That's how you can talk to Nancy directly. So if you need to find her, you know where to find her. But everyone else have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you later.